You're watching LaRouche Pack Saturday Evening Class Series. My name's Tony Papert. Tonight's class is What You See is Not What You Get, The Lessons of Thomas Starr King by Andrea Ingraham. I just say in my own brief observations and introduction, I mean, as the United States, the young United States, entered a period of existential peril where the nation could have been ended less than 100 years after its formation in the crisis of the Civil War. As today, where I think to perhaps the same extent, Americans sense rightly that the nation is in existential peril, that events like a re-election of Joe Biden later this year could be the end of our republic within years or perhaps even months. So back then, with the approach of that existential crisis, which became the Civil War, many Americans in the Union States stepped forward spiritually, intellectually, as well as politically, and then, of course, militarily in the Civil War. There was a kind of renaissance of Americans thinking, which most people know nothing about, but I've begun to learn about it from Andrea Ingraham and her husband, Bob, who've both taught about this. So in my view, the story of Thomas Starr King, who I've just recently come to know about, thanks to Andrea, is a thrilling example of the kind of thing that is happening now in our country, is beginning to happen, and that must happen if the United States is to make it through this crisis. So with that, you're on.
Okay, good evening. So, yeah, what Tony says is very accurate. We're in a very similar kind of crisis today as in the years leading into and through the Civil War, where the future of the country was in question. And while it was a terrible crisis, it also created a situation where people were suddenly more capable of understanding and debate and discussing ideas at the highest level, the kind of ideas that helped found the nation and that were necessary to be revived to revive the nation. So one of the key exemplars of this is Thomas Starr King. Now, we talked about him 2 weeks ago and discussed the incredible intervention he made in California, where he toured all over the state and built up support for the Union cause at a point where California was first in danger of secession and then was still partially not sure what side they were on. And he intervened very forcefully with both patriotic speeches as well as intensive philosophical and theoretical discussion, speeches, lectures, all throughout the state, in the cities and in the mining country and so on, and succeeded in really transforming the whole environment. So I hope to give a sense of his method and how he did that. And that's what I want to talk about tonight, which you might call how he shaped public opinion. I didn't use that word then, but and if you think about the way people think about that now, how to shape public opinion, how to win people over, they think of, well, I don't have to tell you all the all the methods that people try to apply for that, but you can think about that yourself and contrast that to the method that's used here. So I want to talk about two of his most famous lectures. These are two that he had delivered before many times throughout New England and the Northeast. He had written them, I think, both in 1851, and traveled throughout the Lyceum circuit. And they had a profound effect then, but even much more so during the Civil War and the crisis that was gripping the country at that time. So I'm just going to go through them, and it's they're a little bit long. I'm only going to give a brief sketch, of course, of two very long speeches. Each one of these was originally an hour and a half or so long. But I'll see what I can do in a quick synopsis. So the first one is called Substance and Show, or alternately Facts and Forces. And he says, I propose to speak on the difference between substance and show, or the distinction we should make between the facts of the world and life and the causal forces which lie behind and beneath them. No mind which comprehends the issues involved in this distinction will fail to see that the topic is vitally practical. For skepticism or mistaken conceptions of the truth upon this point must degrade our whole theory of life, demoralize our reverence, and make the region with which our faith should be in constant contact thin, dreamy, and spectral. And he goes on, most persons, doubtless, if you place before them a paving stone and a slip of paper, would not hesitate to say that there's much more substance in the rock than in the paper. Yet they might make a great mistake. Suppose that the slip of paper contains the sentence, God is love, or thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, or all men have moral rights by reason of heavenly parentage. Then the paper represents more force and substance than the stone. Heaven and earth may pass away, but such words can never die out or become less real. The word substance means that which stands underneath and supports anything else. Whatever then creates, upholds, classifies anything which our senses behold, though we cannot handle, see, taste, or smell it, is more substantial than the object itself. In this way, the soul, which vivifies, moves, and supports the body, is a more potent substance than the body. You want to talk about the world of matter? There's no such thing. That would be a huge heap of atoms. There would be no motion, no force, no form, no order, no beauty in the universe. See what a sermon astronomy preaches as to the substantial power of invisible things. He loves to talk about astronomy. If the visible universe is so stupendous, what shall we think of the unseen force and vitality in whose arms all its splendors rest? The invisible lever of gravitation, without any fulcrum or purchase, does lift the globe and make it waltz too with its blonde lunar partner, 1,200 miles a minute to the music of the sun. Aye, and heaves sun and systems and Milky Way in majestic cotillons on its ethereal floor. You grasp an iron ball and you call it hard. It is not the iron that is hard, but cohesive force that packs the particles of metal into intense sociability. We turn then to the vegetable kingdom. Is not then the revelation still more wonderful? The forms which we see grow out of substances which are supported by forces which we do not see. The stuff out of which all vegetable appearances are made is reducible to oxygen, hydrogen, carbon, and nitrogen. How does it happen that this common stock is worked up into such different ways? And he goes through all the ways. He names lilies and dahlias and grapevines and orange trees and pine trees. A subtle force of a peculiar kind is at work wherever any vegetable structure adorns the ground and takes to itself its favorite robe. The prominent lesson of science to men, therefore, is faith in the intangible and invisible. Shall we talk of matter as the great reality of the world? The prominent substance is nothing but a battleground of terrific forces. And then he goes on. He says, now let us look at ideas as substantial things. If the true definition of substance is causal and sustaining force, then ideas take the first rank as substances, for the whole universe was thought into order and beauty. The word was, "Let there be light," and there was light. Nature is the language and imagery of divine ideas. Let us see next how applicable the principle we are considering is to the world of man and history. Every house, workshop, church, schoolroom, theater is the representative of an opinion. What the eye sees of them is built of bricks, iron, wood, and mortar by carpenters, smiths, and masons, but the seed from which they grew and the forces by which they are upheld are ideas and affections and conceptions of utility and sentiments of worship. Thus, in all cases, a nation or an army, so far as its persons, all that we can see of it, are concerned, is only a show. The substance of it is the ideas, passions, genius, enthusiasm that pervade it and are not seen. There is no more beautiful or impressive law of history than that by which the past genius, heroism, and patriotic devotedness are woven into the structure of a people, giving it character. A state has a personality that endures through centuries. All its great men and bad men, good laws and vile laws, its faithfulness and its crimes contribute to its character. Nothing dies, but what was fact and show in a living generation becomes force and substance when the actors have departed. See, too, how our revolutionary experience, genius, and fidelity are involved in the character of America. They are not dead facts written in mute annals. They are vital memories of the nation, as though the same men that are now on the stage had once performed them. We take the credit of that wisdom, persistence, and sacrifice partly to ourselves. We are proud of them, and in any crisis of arms would be the stronger, our wit the quicker, our fortitude the more heroic, because of the impulses that would thrill our veins from the beatings of that revolutionary heart. Strike out the idea of America and the hope of America from the people, and a great portion of the force and enthusiasm of our people would be annihilated. That period of our national fortunes is far more than a show in our history. It is part of our present substance. It was not a fact of the past merely. It is a force of our national character. He talks about what a sad thing it is that the case of France after the French Revolution. On the intellectual and moral soil of France, beautiful, enthusiastic France, whose genius has been refining for ages like the wine of its own vineyards. No rights and constitutional freedom have grown that could not be pulled up in a night by a dissolute ruffian wearing and polluting a splendid name. Poor France was overgrown with the merest weedy sentiments of liberty, for it is only weeds that bayonets can scratch up. Finally, character is one of the prominent substances of the world. That is, it is one of the things which do the most as causes to uphold society and quicken it. Character, in the sense of great personal energy, changes the face of nature, digs mines, builds railroads, levels mountains, founds cities, evokes factories, dwarfs the oceans to convenient ponds. Advert for a moment to what the character of Washington has done and will yet do for America and freedom. Better for our country in the crisis of its history to have lost its intellectual treasures, to have parted with half its territory and half its citizens, than to have been robbed of the heart of Washington. His soldiers derived courage, faith, and food from his serene and hopeful majesty. And during that terrible winter at Valley Forge, the nourishment of future ages was in the continuance of the resources in that one breast. His character is part of this Western world forever, as much as the forests or the rocks. So there is an ascending series of creative and substantial forces, beginning with mechanical energies and running up through chemical affinities, vital powers, perception, will, ideas, to personality. Character is the culminating substance of nature, and we may say here that a man may be what he pleases to be. Circumstances often determine how much show a man shall make. To be famous depends on some fortuities. To be a president depends on the acute smellers of a few politicians and a mysterious set of wires. To be rich depends on birth or luck. To be intellectually eminent may depend on the appointment of Providence. But to be a man, in the sense of substance, depends solely on one's own noble ambition and determination to live in contact with God's open atmosphere of truth and right, from which all manliness is inspired and fed. And at the end, he says, we often talk about ghosts and wonder sometimes whether a ghost has ever returned from the dead. But our popular definition of a ghost is just the reverse of the truth. It makes one consist of a soul without a body. Well, really, a specter, an illusion, a humbug of the eyesight and the touch, is a human body not vitalized through and through with a soul. And he says, the climax of my purpose in this address will be gained if it will lead any of you to see that the stuff a great soul is made of is the most real and unwasting material of the universe. So that's a very short summary of a very long speech, but I think it's enough that gives you the idea of what he was doing and of the kind of culture that existed at that time, and the kind of things that people were engaged in, the kind of discussions. The other famous one, one of the most famous ones he did was called Socrates. And again, this was, infinitely more relevant going into and through the Civil War than even it was touring around the Lyceum circuit in the 1850s. If you remember the discussion 2 weeks ago, he was confronting constantly all these different sophistries being put forward by the secessionists and the copperheads and other traitors. And just to remind you of a few of the arguments they were putting forth, they were trying to say that the idea of states seceding from the United States was the equivalent of the colonies seceding from Great Britain or declaring independence from Great Britain. They had the thing about clergymen should stay out of politics. They had rationales for that. This whole thing about one of the big arguments being put forth by the slave owners was that the framers, the people that wrote the Constitution, said that slavery was bad and that somehow we should phase it out and get rid of it. But now we know that they were wrong, that slavery, in fact, is the correct place for the African. Some that said the war would cost too much. There was the ones that said Christ taught peace, therefore a minister should not be advocating to support the war. And on and on. There was the question of Negro regiments that came up, the question of ballot boxes on the battlefield. So all of these things, they would come up with these twisted arguments to justify. And in every case, Thomas Starr King, wrote a speech about them in which he destroyed their arguments and their idiocy. And the reason he was capable of doing this is because he had mastered the method of Socrates. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about his lecture on Socrates. And then I'm also going to ask Tony Papert if he wants to comment on it, because I must say that Tony happens to be probably the world's leading expert on Socrates and Plato today. And when he first read this speech, his response was, I have not seen a better description of Socrates since other than Plato and maybe Xenophon. And both of those guys lived at the time of Socrates and knew him. And it was a totally different thing for somebody 2,000 years later to be making it accessible to a popular audience. This is not a schoolroom or a university or some academic exercise. This is being taken directly to regular American audience. So anyway, if Tony wants to say anything, I'll say a few things about what he said, and if Tony wants to comment, he certainly do so. So he says, the subject of my discourse is Socrates. Though his name is familiar to human lips as the representative of the highest spirit of duty, little is generally known of his life and character. His spiritual physiognomy is not clearly seen among the cloudy sanctity which envelops him in the reverential regard of men. It is known or believed that he was a preacher of pure morals and a man of invincible purity of life, a light walking in darkness, perhaps the clearest light that brightened the pre-Christian years. Still, the man is but feebly perceived by most of those who revere him. And he goes on, says, what was called philosophy in Greece before Socrates was most tedious and fruitless stuff. A continent of speculation and fantastically changing mist clouds, having no basis, guided by no law, leading to no result. Socrates saw it and said so. He marveled that none of the great thinkers had taken up the question which the soul of man suggests. The great region of inquiry and interest is not the world of nature, but human nature. What is man here for? What is the law of happiness? Where is the path of nobleness and peace? What is the foundation of the law of duty? These themes Socrates did not find treated in the books of the schools, and at about the maturity of his manhood, he determined to impress upon his countrymen the importance of one sentence: know thyself. And he then shows how Socrates waged this war on the sophists, which were nothing but the academic elites of the day, you know, or subservient to the ruling class of Athens. And they were kind of like a thought police that were controlling everything that people were supposed to think. You know what that kind of thing is about. But he says of them, these were a class of instructors, often itinerant, in rhetoric, eloquence, gesture, correct use of language, and the general knowledge which would be a good outfit for an Athenian man of the world, and which was essential to polished bearing and practical success. It was not that the sophists openly taught immoral doctrines that Socrates objected to them, but they did not teach anything scientifically, did not ground their pupils on the fundamental principles of certainty. They diverted ambition from a patient and slow mastery of these, turned their scholars from a steady mining for the diamonds of wisdom to a scramble for the spangles of a surface information. And so whatever might be their excellences, Socrates saw that the sophists were vitiating the mental principles of the young. Instead of inspiring a method, they imparted a knack. Their aims were wholly practical and therefore low. He would make men thorough, earnest, and reverent thinkers. They would make them acute debaters, ready tacticians, accomplished orators. They would fit them for eminence in the forums of Greece. He would make them wrestlers with ideas in the gymnasium of science. They did not pursue nor inculcate wisdom for its own sake, but only for the sake of one's private interest and political success. And so in the sight of Socrates, the sophists had no mental modesty or humility, and were but flaunting courtesans of knowledge. Socrates sought these people out and would prick their brilliant parachutes and let out the gas. And he describes his exchanges with the various students. His failed student Alcibiades typified the history of all lawless ambition and dissolute license, who injured his country almost fatally and died in banishment and shame and by the arrows of midnight assassins. But what he could not do for Alcibiades, he did for Plato. Never was the service of education acknowledged with more ardent gratitude. Never was it repaid with such delicate reverence. And he then goes on to describe Plato's methods and his actions. But meanwhile, not a few saw with alarm that his severe speculations were prying up the foundations of the state polytheism, unsettling faith in the thunders of Zeus and the trident of Poseidon. The ultra-conservatives of Athens feared that the state would fall if the throne of Zeus was undermined. And so King was leading up to the story of the indictment and prosecution of Socrates, which he then goes into in some depth. He says Socrates' case was brought before the tribunal of the people, 3 accusers appearing against him with an indictment that held 3 counts: that Socrates did not believe the gods whom the cities held sacred, that he designed to introduce new deities, and that he corrupted the youth. And he then goes into great detail on the trial. The trial itself, his refusal to plea bargain or to read a prepared defense by a legal expert, and says he did not renounce truth and simplicity. He cross-questioned his chief accusers to show the falsity of the charges in their spirit, and then his talk was an impeachment of Athens, not a defense of his own career. His supreme haughtiness and affectionate assertion of superiority surprised his enemies and determined the judges to put his temper to the final strain. After finding him guilty and proposing the sentence of death, the judges offered Socrates an opportunity to plead for a lesser penalty. He made a mockery of the judges, and they pronounced the sentence of death. When his friend Crito arranged a plan for him to escape, he calmly reasoned down all his entreaties and pictured to him how the personified laws of Athens would reproach him for his ingratitude if he should violate them now. How droll it would seem for him to escape wrapped in a disguise of cloaks and skins, and how much better it was to suffer than to commit injustice. The pages of Plato, he says, give us a full account of the last day's intercourse between himself and friends in prison. After taking leave of his wife, the most of the day was occupied with a long and thorough treatment of the question of immortality. And he goes through all that. And he says, the judges of Socrates are forgotten. His accusers are remembered with infamy by association with his name. His prison is one of the sacred places in the memory of the race. While his career is the strength of reformers now and preaches to all men the majesty of self-sacrifice and the glory of devotion. And the loyalty of his life, the firmness of his principles, and the serenity of his bearing in his last hours fortify more powerfully than his arguments our faith in immortality. So that is all I will say about that for now. I mean,
yeah, I'll speak about if you'd like.
Go ahead.
Come in. I mean, to me, this was an amazing lecture. Of course, it is lengthy, and she gave you only part, but perhaps from that part you can get some of the sense of the whole thing. I mean, it's very accurate. I mean, he did tremendous, he had tremendous knowledge. This was a man who I think spent 2 years in school. I mean, he had tremendous knowledge of Socrates, Plato, Athens in that period, and so forth, encyclopedic knowledge. But it's as actually Andrea said this. I mean, it's the only, or she implied it. It's the only portrayal I've ever read, except, as she said, for Plato and Xenophon, who knew Socrates in person. This is the only portrayal which takes Socrates, the man, as a person, as an individual, his private life, puts it together with his philosophy. I mean, this was, as it may be clear from what Andrea said, this was no professor, anything but. I mean, his theories were not, theories to write in term papers or even doctoral dissertations. This was the essence of him, and he staked his life on the truth and gave his life for the truth. So, I mean, and then Socrates, the person, the philosopher you like, also the politician, because in Athens of that day, Socrates was not, he had no special, office or something, but nor did he seek one. But in the Athens of that day, many political duties rotated among the citizens by lot. So there's also Socrates, the political figure, and many other things. I mean, his advice to politicians uh, as well. So it's the only thing I've ever read that takes all of this Socrates and it puts it together, and you see one real living person who lives still. I've never read anything like that, as I say, except for those Greeks who lived contemporaneously. It reminds me of Benjamin Franklin's statement, I think, about Cotton Mather, his great teacher, if you like, where he said, I knew Mather in his pulpit and I knew Mather in his home. And I mean, here, Thomas Starr King seems to know Socrates in public, in private, in politics, and all as one person. It's an incredible picture. And the fact that he communicated this to just the great great numbers of Americans who learned something which they could not learn in university, as far as I know, and they learned from him. I mean, I wanted to read. It's brief in any case. The end of that. I wanted to read and put it up on the screen, hoping it would be more comprehensible. Although Andrea did a very good job of being comprehensible without a text in front of you. But let me just put it up there. Oh, sure. You want to read it from the most remarkable? Actually, I think I can. If there now, I can read it.
Go ahead.
The most remarkable saying, perhaps, that has been reported of Socrates is this: that in respect to those great questions, we ought to take, that in respect to these great questions, we ought to take the best of human reasonings, that which is most difficult to be confuted, and embark on it as on a raft, so as to sail through life amid its storms, unless we could be carried more safely in a surer conveyance furnished by some divine instruction. Down the river of life, let's say along its Athenian banks, he had floated upon his raft of reason serene, in cloudy as in smiling weather, for 70 years. And now the night is rushing down, and he's reached the mouth of the stream, and the great ocean is before him, dim heaving in the dusk. But he betrays no fear. There is land ahead, he thought. Eternal continents there are that rise in constant light beyond the gloom. He trusted still in the raft his soul had built, and with a brave farewell to the few true friends who stood by him on the shore, he put out into the darkness, a moral Columbus, trusting in his haven on the faith of an idea. It's so true and so moving.
Okay, well, that might raise the question of who was the audience and what did they think about all this? You got this in California, he's addressing these audiences of miners and farmers and laborers, and and are these people going to pay money and sit for 2 hours and listen to this kind of thing? So I'll give you one report that I got in the Sacramento Union in January of 1861. So he had given this, he had gone on this tour of the state. This is the crisis was unfolding. I mean, don't forget, Lincoln got elected in November 1860. South Carolina declares they've seceded in December. And then in January, other states are all in the process of having secession conventions and things like that, and would 7 more states or 6 more states would secede. So in the midst of all this, he's giving a lecture tour throughout the state, and this is what he's talking about. Why is he bringing them this in the middle of this kind of crisis? So anyway, I'll read the review of it so you know what the response was. The church was filled to its utmost capacity for this is in Sacramento in January 1861. The church was filled to its utmost capacity for permanent seating, and temporary seats were brought in order to give additional accommodations. The subject was Socrates, his life, character, and humor. The remarks of Mr. King on the excellent subject which he had selected were listened to with evident appreciation, judging from the frequent applause manifested and in which the ladies largely joined. In his discourse, the lecturer showed with great clearness that Socrates was far in advance of his age, that his moral perceptions were acute and elevated, and that he must have been an ardent believer in the immortality of the soul and a spiritual existence hereafter. As a home missionary to the Athenians in their daily walk and conversation, the sketches of Socrates as drawn by Mr. King were lifelike and exceedingly graphic, at times impressing the audience with a feeling of seriousness and again eliciting sensations bordering on the humorous. In the course of the lecture, occasional references were made in a quiet and effective way, and in the course of illustration, to the imbecility of the president. That would be James Buchanan, who is still the president. Lincoln wasn't going to be inaugurated until March. And in the face of this crisis with states seceding, he's acting totally paralyzed and listening to his advisors, who were mostly traitors and secessionists. So he says, in the course of illustration to the imbecility of the president and the mischievous action of South Carolina, the audience responding heartily to the manifest hits of the lecturer. So, and he also managed to make it every time more, relevant to the current situation. So that was the response, and he went on doing this. What he would typically do in a lot of these lecture tours is he would do one of his patriotic speeches, and then 2 days later he would speak in the same town, give one of these philosophical lectures. There's a lot of lectures he did on that. There's one he did on books and reading, for instance. I mean, this goes to the question that Tony was raising of how he knows Socrates so well, even though he lived 2,000 years ago. It's like he lived next door to him. But he gives this example in a lecture called Books and Reading, which he did at the Mercantile Library Association and elsewhere. And he makes the case that since the invention of the printing press and the availability of books and printed material over the last 500 years, that this has completely transformed the world. That you now have a situation where you can know somebody that lived 2,000 years ago. He says, like a lot of Christians wish they lived at the time of Christ. They wish they could have known him personally, walked down the street. He said, but the fact is that the average person today in America reading a book can know more about Christ than the average citizen of Nazareth, who might pass him on the street or might, see one of his statements or something like that. And he gives similar examples to that. He says, you think it would be nice to know Shakespeare, to stop in and talk to him? Well, it would be, but frankly, if you listen to or read Hamlet or Macbeth or something, you will know Shakespeare a lot better than if you went and visited him. Similarly with Beethoven, wouldn't that be nice to go and meet Beethoven? But the fact is that if you go and listen to the Ninth Symphony, you'll know him a lot better than if you ran into him on the street. And that's the result of the fact that you have printed music books and that people can now play Beethoven's music all over the world. So this is how he thought about it. He had another lecture he liked to give called Sight and Insight, in which he talks about the difference. Again, this is kind of a variation on the theme, but it's he talks about the eye and the difference between a human eye and an animal eye, that you have an eagle that has a much better eye than we do. But if you put a beautiful statue or painting in front of him, he just sees a piece of stone or a wall. Not to mention astronomy. An eagle can look at the skies, and what does he see? He sees these lights, but doesn't mean anything. He doesn't know a difference between a moon or a star or a planet or a comet or an airplane, if they had airplanes, which they didn't. That was just my idea. And similarly, with hearing, you can have the most beautiful sounds in the world, but if a dog or a deer has a much better hearing than we do, but if you brought him to a symphony, he'd turn the other way or run the other direction or sniff around for something to eat. So these are the kind of things he was doing. And in fact, that brings us to the last lecture I was going to talk about. It's actually the last lecture he did in San Francisco, which was in February of 1864, and it was on music. And again, it's a lengthy speech, and I'll just give you a few highlights. But here's what he says. He says, one of the richest chapters of natural religion, showing how the outward world has been created to be the servant of man and express his quality, might be drawn from the power of musical expression hidden in things and ready to be combined by genius. By hidden in things, he means all the things that musical instruments are made out of, and he lists them: horns and bones and shells and whatnot. He talks about how much richer is the alphabet of music than literature. He's always got this in-depth idea of a knowledge of science. He says sound travels 1,130 feet a second, and the vibrations from any instrument a performer is playing will convey not only the loudness or softness, the precision and swell of the tones, but also how much the inmost quality of the man, as well as his fingers or his breath, is involved in his work, whether his intellect is chiefly engaged, and how much he has, and what is the grade of it, or whether his sentiments are uppermost, and what is their level of fineness and intensity. All of this can be conveyed in music, and and from the music, you know the person that's playing it. And he says, it is only when a mighty thought or sentiment rolls through waves of sound, combining them so that they cooperate on our heart and mind, that pure sublimity begins. All else that we call sublimity is only a surprise of the senses. In nature, there is no combination of great sentiment and the developing of an idea or emotion in sound. Man is the organ through which the infinite spirit creates this addition to the treasury of beauty and the resources of life. And it seems to me that the method of a musical composer of the first rank in producing his work is the most subtle of all the processes of genius and nearest in kindred with the movements of the creative intelligence. He describes how the mind of Mozart surpasses even that of Shakespeare, based on Mozart's own account of how he composed the piece, which is that it's not from a thin stream of melody, but it burst full-voiced, as it were, from an ideal orchestra or a celestial chorus into his imagination, from which it was only copied into a mortal score. It is only from instances like this, where the sphere of music furnishes more than any other region of art, which the sphere of music furnishes more than any other region of art, that we can catch a hint of the movements of infinite thoughts from which the whole order of nature has issued and is sustained every moment as a starry anthem in space. And then he talks about Beethoven conducting the Ninth Symphony for the last time when he was totally deaf. He says a friend touched him on the shoulder as after it was finished. He says a friend touched him as he stood on the stage with his back to the audience and made signs that he should turn around and see the enthusiasm of the thousands whom his music had thrilled. He turned with a listless face, which at once struck the multitude with a fresh consciousness of his affliction. And then we are told that as the floodgates of pleasure, compassion, and sympathy were opened, there followed a volcanic explosion of applause, which seemed as if it would never end, and which the master could not fail to hear as well as see. And he says, and recalling that scene, the miracle of genius seems the more fathomless. This man's most original and wonderful creations were produced when his earthly ear had been almost paralyzed, and it was painful to hear him attempt to play the piano. It was in this state that, out of pulsations born to the ear of his soul, he wrought out the architecture of harmony. And he says, the greatest privilege of city life seems to me to be its musical opportunities. He says, in the country, you have beautiful scenery. A banquet is provided for the eye. And you also have books with which you can commune with the great minds of history and thoughts of our own age and history. But the city alone can give us a chorus, a sublime organ, and an orchestra. In these, some of the rich and manifest advances of modern over ancient civilizations are summed up. In fact, he talks about how if an ancient Greek came in to visit us today, he would not be particularly impressed by our advances in sculpture and architecture. But if you took him into a concert hall, he would be blown away. He doesn't use that word, but he would realize that he would see the great advances that have been made by modern civilization. And he says, all that we cultivate of its highest spirit in its great religious expressions here will go with us as preparations for eternity. I do not know why the Andante of the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven may not be played in heaven. The angelic masters must be inspired beyond our present capacity of appreciation if they can produce anything that will make that seem meager. We shall slough off probably our English vocabulary and tongue in the grave. But even in the final gathering of the redeemed out of every nation, tongue, and clime, one strophe of the consummate anthem to the Lamb and through him to the infinite, who shall put all things under his feet, may be the hallelujah chorus of the Messiah, contributed from this earth to form part of the everlasting language of the skies. So I think that was a fitting note to end on. And I think I mentioned that he was in poor health when he came here. He worked ceaselessly for 4 years for the cause, for saving the nation. And within 2 weeks of this, he would be dead.
Oh, God.
He had poured out, you could say, his last full measure of devotion to the Union and to God. Now, when he died, there were, a tremendous outpouring of sentiments and comments of all sorts, and I can't possibly go through all of them. So I'm just going to name two. One is from a neighbor of King's from Boston, who was also a minister. And he said they disagreed on everything theologically. But this minister said that it recounts that he recently met a man on a train who was a native of Kentucky, but a resident and soldier of California, who greatly surprised him by his intelligent, high-toned conversation. He said, the soldier said, the battle between right and might was fairly joined in that new state, and he had no doubt the right would win. Do you know Mr. King? Asked the minister. Oh, yes, was the reply. And he it was who won me from the side of violence to the side of justice. My last evening before starting for the seat of war was spent with him. He has breathed the spirit of true manhood into that gold-digging population. Already the younger and controlling minds have caught the inspiration and have vowed to one another and to God that California shall be both the richest and the purest state of the Union. We shall make it that, for we have the natural resources and climate, and now we are beginning to have the conscience. There were tremendous reports of the funeral, which I will only quote one. The funeral was Sunday. He died on March 4th. So actually, this week, 160 years ago. This was a report from his dear friend, Charles Wente, who went on to become a minister, and in his behalf, there's an interesting story about how King rescued him from a desperate situation in the beginning when he first came to San Francisco. So he's writing this report of the funeral. And he says, "Never shall I forget the two Negro women who came forth with streaming eyes from the throng, and kneeling by the inanimate form of this friend of their race, with passionate sobs, kissed the folds of the United States flag, which formed his burial shroud. It was by the sacrifices of such heroes of the spirit that the Stars and Stripes had become to them also the emblem of liberty, the flag of their country." So I will end with that.